Yes, Leif Jones with Louisiana Central. We're the Regional Economic Development Organization for the Tin Parish area, which obviously includes Pineville and Refuge Parish area.
Okay, and the Vita Nova team. We'll start with Tim.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Tim Hubbard. I'm with Vita Nova. Been with Vita Nova about 4 years. I'm actually based in Frankfort, Kentucky. It's good to see everyone again.
And hello, everyone. I'm Juliette Brodelsky with Vita Nova, and coming to you today from sunny Connecticut. So you'll be hearing from me quite a bit later. So nice to be with everyone today. Thanks.
All right, and I'm Dale Coop. I'm the product manager for Vita Nova, and it's been a great pleasure to work with our team, and we're excited to share, which I'm going to do, the presentation. Everybody see?
Yes.
Beautiful. That's the last slide. Let's go to the first slide. That'd be a good start. All right, so today it's the first webinar of 2 webinars in our scope to really kind of, the end of it will be the financial feasibility analysis, which will be webinar 2 in February. We'll talk more about that later on. And we're here to talk about what we've done so far, all the review and study that we've done, and really focused on the stakeholder interviews. We did the introductions. You know, our scope is we're sort of fast tracking our scope to get it done within the schedule, and we're right on schedule. We've done reviewed a ton of documents that, you know, I didn't imagine that we would get that many, and we did. So the team, everybody's introduced. These are the players. Rebecca is going to be on, and she's going to have her associate Jennifer on. I've been talking to Rebecca, and so is Tim right along. Of course, the local stakeholders are the mayor and Doug, and all of the folks on this call. And Leif is on the call, which is great. But we need the economic development input and perspective. Basically, our scope, just to review it, is in total is to do the interviews, the stakeholder interviews, which were significant. And then in the next part is to analyze the different options and potential agreements and the funding that could come to the project. We have some hopefully creative ideas and some models that might work based on the outcome of our work. We've done pretty much what we're supposed to do in terms of the schedule. The funding research is an ongoing process where, you know, we're going to continue doing this all the way to the end. You know, as Juliette and I have done a lot of work with grants. We're constantly reading about new programs, and the government is constantly announcing new programs. So you never know when new stuff's going to pop up. We have some ideas for research models, and then in webinar 2, we'll really focus on the funding aspect of it and come up with some ideas that you can take to use. So what we've done is review lots of reports, and we'll show that in a minute to really catch up. ICF did, they just finished actually their work and have submitted it for the various folks to review. I've read the report. We've had 3 meetings with them. We really focused on collaborating on them, so we didn't just repeat what they did. We wanted to build on what they did. And so we've been working with them, and they've been extremely cooperative. And it's been a good experience. We've learned a lot about the site and the project just from talking, and then their documents have been helpful as well. Tim has conducted many stakeholder interviews. I'm personally a huge fan of stakeholder interviews because you learn a lot of stuff that you don't learn from data and news reports or even you know, the political structure in any region or town. So working with stakeholders is really important. We definitely will, again, recommend some funding strategies and look at the site from the perspective of what a developer, because they are the marketplace. So we've reviewed lots of reports, including what ICF just submitted in the middle of December. The market data that came from them, we've looked at some of our own, as a matter of fact. And you know, the key things that came out of the market data from ICF, and there's many more issues that we can talk about, but for the sake of general things, you know, there's been a smaller population growth the retail marketplace has lower rents in Pineville. All of these things are opportunities. You can say that they're a challenge or they're an opportunity. I see them all as opportunities. Office space is in high demand, which was a pleasant surprise based on some of the ideas that have come out. And the marketplace all over the country has really fluctuated over the last several years. And Alexandria seems to be a more stable market in terms of vacancy rates and things like that, absorption rates. There's not a lot of multifamily housing options. Again, another national problem, but it certainly applies here. And there's been very little multifamily building going on. Median income is lower in Pineville than the areas. That is pretty much what people understand. We looked at many documents. These are all the things. Tim and I met with the facility manager at the hospital, and they provided a wealth of information, documents to look at. We've been finding them all over the place. It's really been helpful to see, you know, all of the factors on the site related to the buildings and the site and other things that have been studied through time going back even in the last few years. We have looked at the RFPs. I know that the community is active. They just approved an RFP from what I understand. And there were other parcels that were, I believe, sold off, 2 of them maybe. But basically so this is a dynamic situation that's going on in the town, but there's still, like, you know, 350 more acres to deal with. So we are staying on top of what's going on to do the best job we can. That's sort of the quick, you know, 50,000 feet up overview of what we've been looking at. I'm going to turn it over to Tim for him to talk about the stakeholder interviews and some of the findings. Tim, just tell me to go to the next slide when you're ready.
Okay, dope. Thank you, Dale. Appreciate it. Thanks everyone for being on the call again today, and good to see everybody. Good to see you, Sherry. You're my neighbor in Louisville. But yes, this is a list of the folks that we had conversations with, and that's what Dale, Juliet, and I focused on. Instead of being interviews, we focused on called these conversations essentially about the hospital property. Again, we had a good discussion, Doug, with you and the mayor, Leif, with you and Jim, and the other folks here that you see on the list. That many of these folks have direct involvement with the property. We had a couple of discussions with Rebecca and Jennifer, and I know they'll be on the call probably a little bit later today. But and again, everyone to a person was very familiar with the hospital property, and really have a clear understanding of its potential impact to the whole region, not just Pineville or Alexandria, but the actual whole region of central Louisiana. So very good input received, I felt like, from everyone. They were very open with their time. And as Dale mentioned, we received so much information, maps, reports, surveys, a lot of good information for us to have. Provided a great background on the property. So we greatly appreciate everyone's cooperation on this. So next slide. In terms of initial findings, overall site conditions, the Central Louisiana State Hospital began operations back in 1906 on land purchased by the state. It's operated there since that time. It includes approximately 409 acres of land. Over the years, as more patients were received, additional buildings were constructed. We understand there's approximately 118 structures on the campus currently. It's based on our discussions with the administrators there. So that's a whole lot of buildings out there spread over that property. Some of these are residential properties located along Rainbow Drive. The majority of the buildings are vacant and are in disrepair, so in pretty bad shape, really, and more than likely cannot be salvaged, the majority of the buildings there. So again, LDH, the Louisiana Department of Health, is still operating on the central part of the property and a number of buildings there. They currently house 115 patients and have about 400 employees, including contractors that are working there. Of course, they're making plans to transition staff and patients out to the new facility that's being built north of here at the end of this year, I think is is the target date. There's been some delays, I think, through supply chain shortages and the like to prevent the construction of the new facility from being finished, but they're hoping by the end of the year to be in a new facility. It's located north of here next to Pinecrest, which is another state psychiatric facility. So again, the property is very scenic. Again, we wish we could actually visit the property. It's not going to be part of our project, unfortunately, but I'm sure it's beautiful with the mature pine trees. Fort Randolph, Fort Bulow State Historic Sites, and Pearson Lake border the property to the south. Highway 165 and 71 run along the western boundary of the property. Downtown Pineville is just southeast of the property. Next slide, Dale. Of course, many of the buildings are one or two-story structures with concrete masonry walls. Many of them were constructed from the 40s to the 1970s. We understand the military built a number of buildings there in the 40s. Most of those are in pretty bad shape. Buildings, of course, most of them, given their age, are very likely to have asbestos, lead-based paint issues that will have to be dealt with in terms of demolition and those kind of things. Again, most of the buildings are vacant other than those that are currently being occupied by LDH. The Rose Cottage and Dairy Barn have been entered in the National Historic Register for historic buildings. And both of those properties are actually some of the oldest properties or buildings out there. Let's see, the Rose Cottage was built in 1917. So it's the oldest property out there. See a picture there. It's a two-story Renaissance revival structure. And it actually was built originally as a pathology laboratory. I thought that was interesting. And one interesting side note is that the architect for the Rose Cottage that you see there on the picture was a former patient at the facility. His name was Joseph H. Carlin. So I thought that was very interesting when we look back at the history. And he was also involved with building the dairy barn in 1923. So again, those are two of the older structures there, plus the administration building in the central part of the property. I think it dates from 1927. So those are the three older buildings on the property. There is an abandoned cemetery on the property, which has been surveyed. There's been some subsurface investigations to determine the overall boundary of the cemetery so that everyone knows that going into potential redevelopment of the property. So that area is definitely, they stay away from those areas. So they've got a pretty good feel for where graves are. But again, there could be some graves outside of that location too. So next slide, Leo. The utilities and infrastructure. The state owns the on-site utilities there, water, sewer, gas, and electric. And of course, all of the utilities are probably in the 60 to 80 year age range. So definitely will need to be updated. No matter what type of redevelopment happens out there, there's going to have to be a lot of upgrades to the water system, wastewater system. We understand that there have been some upgrades to the water system back in the 80s. And the natural gas system, that's a positive. We understand there's 18 PSI natural gas that's available to the site, with Atmos Energy being the provider. So that's a positive for future redevelopment. Again, the state owns the substation that ties into CLECO there at the intersection of Shamrock and Rainbow Drive. And we understand in talking, we had a brief discussion with CLECO, and they have a primary meter out there, and it's actually served by three-phase electric, which is good. Essentially, they feel like that three-phase electric would be sufficient for future uses out there. It actually, for the residential use that's planned and some of the commercial, even retail, that should be sufficient power. It would have to obviously be remetered with individual meters out there, and the lines would have to be underground, more than likely to be resilient. But it's at least is a positive to know that there is sufficient three-phase power currently out there. Again, the roads are single lane. They don't really support multiple vehicle traffic, so the roads will have to be upgraded as well. There is security to the site as well, 24/7 security guard on the main entrance there. There is a contract that the state has for fiber with AT&T that serves the whole campus. So that's a positive as well. The LDH actually has the overall responsibility for property maintenance. They do have a budget that's provided by the state legislature to help them with doing some of the maintenance out there on some of the buildings. It obviously doesn't handle all of the necessary maintenance, but things that pop up, they can access funds to take care of some of those things. So next slide, yeah. The State Office of State Lands sort of manages the property as the owner of the property for the state. They have conducted or paid for property appraisals and surveys, asbestos testing out there. They coordinate those activities with the city and the Downtown Development District with Doug on any parcels that are identified that may be up for sale or through an RFP process. The state coordinates with the city on those properties. The state also maintains a list of properties that's updated. They're inspected every 3 years due to the fact that they do carry insurance on the property. So they have to kind of know what the condition is in those general terms. And so that does happen about every 3 years. They do the walkthrough out there for the buildings. In terms of ongoing assessments, and I know Sherry is involved with Tetra Tech working with LADEQ, with Rebecca and Jennifer on doing the phase 1 environmental assessments for the properties. And currently, it's understanding the focus on the phase 1s on the vacant properties and those properties that may have some environmental concerns out there, which there are some. So I think that's the current focus. So there appear to be sufficient funds, I think up to $2 million in the US EPA brownfield grant, a portion or large portion of that, I think Rebecca has earmarked to do those phase 1 assessments on the property. And then I think there's a brownfield assessment grant, 300,000 that will likely be used to do phase 2 investigations for those properties that have some environmental concerns that'll need some additional sampling. Some of the specific environmental issues that were found from previous environmental assessments include abandoned USTs. I think there's up to around 24 of those underground tanks that will have to be investigated and properly closed, and a number of above ground tanks. And we've already talked about the asbestos, lead paint, other materials out there. There's a lot of solid waste, waste tires and debris that's scattered throughout the property that will have to be disposed of properly. And in talking with the engineer, we did find, or he mentioned the northwest portion of the property is a historic dumping area. I think there are ravines up there by the maintenance building that a lot of materials were dumped back in the 40s and 50s. So it's probably an area that should be looked at and probably will be looked at in the future, just to make sure there's not any hazardous materials up there that need to be addressed in that area. And then again, portions of the property are within a 500 and 100-year floodplain. We understand that flooding is not a huge issue out there, or at least on a regular basis, but I know the southern portions of the property, the low areas next to Fort Bulow, Fort Randolph, I think do flood occasionally. So that's an issue that has to be considered and looked at. Next slide, Dale. Property disposition process. There was legislation put in place, I think 2015 by the Louisiana State Legislature that handled how the property, the hospital property would be disposed of in terms of sale. And it names the city, specifically the Downtown Development District, to handle the sale of the property, coordinating those activities with the state. In 2019, the legislation was amended to direct those proceeds from the sale of those parcels to go to the fund the construction of the new hospital. So that was a specific change that was made to help in building the new hospital. Of course, the city benefits by any properties that are sold and redeveloped, gets those properties back on the tax rolls to generate revenue. So again, the state office of state lands coordinates with the city on any parcels to be sold. One parcel has been sold and redeveloped a few years ago, the Why Not Stop along the highway. And there was an RFP that was issued in November for 11-acre parcel. And so our understanding, the city has accepted a proposal for that 11-acre. And then there is an RFP for a 20-acre parcel that has not been submitted or not been issued yet by the city, but that's one that's being considered. So leasing of land, we did discuss that with the city and the state, and it's not currently being considered, although I think it's something that could be looked at in the future. As part of the RFP process, the developers agreed to take on the demolition and asbestos part of the project on each side, and they agree to initiate development within 12 months. If they don't, then there is a provision to claw back that purchase of that property, or at least a portion of that from that sale. And I think the last point is currently, and talking with Doug and the mayor and with the engineer, I think the focus on parcels that are sold now are the low hanging fruit, the properties that are located along the commercial strip along Highway 165 and 71 that have access to utilities and are properties that would be easily developed, more easily developed in the central part of the property, which will require more upgrade in utilities and infrastructure. So that's been the focus so far on the parcels that have been redeveloped. So.
Okay. All right, we're going to turn the slides over to Juliet, and she's going to talk about the reuse goals and, more on the land use side of things.
So before we start talking about kind of our overall approach, are there any questions or comments on any of the, kind of the information that we collected, or does anyone want to add anything before we move on to this next section? You can raise your hand through the chat as we're going to, if there's anything you want to add. So please feel free to raise your hand. That we do have a lot of folks on here, so we're happy to take questions as we go. And I did want to just note too that we were joined by Rebecca and Cheston as you were talking, Tim. So welcome to the meeting.
Welcome.
Okay. Yeah, so how did we get involved in this? Initially, we've done a number of projects with ICF, and they asked us to take a look at their conceptual site reuse plan and put together a funding strategy on how, the city and the state might go about financing the build out of it. Right. So, seems like a pretty straightforward request. We have a development, we have a site. Oh, and Michael Taylor is here too. Thank you, Michael. He's our principal at the president of Vita Nova. So thanks, Mike. Yeah, so on the surface, it looks like a pretty straightforward project. You take you have a site, what the infrastructure is. You're going to try to project how much revenue can be generated from future development. What are the costs of the infrastructure? And then where's your gap? What are what kind of funding needs to be brought to the table outside of just conventionally a private investment that funds tax revenue that gets put back into the site for services and infrastructure, right? So that's kind of where we came about. That was our initial thinking. So we looked at the master plan that you did in 1998. We looked at the ICF plan. And, obviously there's been a long time commitment to this site, and, it's like you've been waiting for the state to finally relocate from the property. Wouldn't this be a great redevelopment site, right? So that's we get it. That's a great goal for the city. So in the ICF plan, and consistent with the 20 plus year old master plan, you're looking to take this former state hospital site that's still in some use and turn it into an kind of a village west, right? So right to the west of downtown, you want to have some single family homes, some multifamily housing, senior housing, retail, commercial, office, um, open space areas, and infrastructure to support that. So from a developer's perspective, it's a great opportunity. So if you want to go to the next slide, Dale. And
Yeah.
we, on a surface, it seems, there's a lot of opportunities here. You have good highway access, you have developers that have come to the table, they're expressed interest in site acquisition, you've developed some of your parcels, you have a good system in place, it appears, for disposing of property. There's systems set up, you have relationships. The state is, undertaking the cleanup. You all have a common vision for the site. There are state and federal grants that might be available to offset, some of these more public financing needs, for the assessment, the public roadways, any kind of reconstruction of the public infrastructure, those kinds of things. And even we learned, even above and beyond grants and the inherent value of selling the property, the city is empowered to enact special taxation districts. So that is also an opportunity. Um, that being said, there's some challenges with this site. So this is not a greenfield site. This is not a vacant site. This is a brownfield site. So our job is to kind of look at your development, goals and needs, and say, okay, what are the things they really need to finance? If this was a conventional development, we would look at it in a different way. But this is a brownfield site with a lot of existing conditions that we're seeing as, okay, these are things that are going to need you know some kind of funding strategy. So that's why we had Tim, and with the help of all your local folks, and thank you very much for providing all this incredible information. We're now looking at it to say, okay, let's behind the curtain, what's really going to need to be funded and figured out. So first of all, the interior portions of the site, you know, we think that it might be needs further evaluation of just the physical infrastructure that's there. We didn't see report studies on physical infrastructure. The general assessment is, oh, these facilities all need to be torn out and replaced. But then as we dug a little deeper, like the utility said, no, we have three-phase service and there's an interconnect here, and some of that could be salvaged. And so that's one of the things. So there's a data gap there. What does the infrastructure really consist of? Some of the interior portions of the site might be physically, not able to be developed. You have historic structures on the site. You have a burial ground on the site. We didn't look at the encumbrances that may exist. There's, roadways and, connections to utilities and gas lines. Those are all might be physical limitations to actually where the developments go. As we've discussed, there are, a large number of hazardous building materials and buildings on the site that would require demolition likely before you can even, talk about the next phase of development. Who's taking those buildings down? How much does that cost? What's the priority? Are the developers are really going to, take that on as a cost, or can the public entities facilitate some of those things? There's mature trees that are throughout the site. Do these need to be protected? These are the questions that we started asking ourselves, and trying to say, well, who's is this a funding need? The cost estimates to repair and replace the infrastructure, as far as we could tell, we didn't see those studies. So again, these are things for consideration. Go ahead, Dale. As we talked about, that there's 118 structures. Abatement and demolition costs, even with the $2 million that's available, if you can just kind of extrapolate out how much abatement and demolition costs, that's a big number. So we just don't know how much that's going to cost. So that would be a helpful number to have. in addition to the demolition and abatement, you also have soil potential, soil remediation issues. If you're talking about putting housing and public parks, these have different level of cleanup requirements. So again, what are the estimated, what are the probable cost estimates to do that cleanup associated with these historic sites? We don't have that number. You know, against as as Tim said, the roads have not been evaluated. Do they need to be, are they sufficient? Are they insufficient? At what point do they become obsolete? Are they, can they accommodate, public safety vehicles, that kind of thing. Those kind of things, these are data gaps that would need to be, further explored. And, one, other large issue is, we haven't looked at, or, it didn't look like the study had looked at, if you're looking at putting in, several hundred units of housing, do you have the capacity in your school systems? Do you have your capacity in your public safety systems? Has anybody done a cost estimate of the potential impacts to existing public services, fire, police? That's a typical, evaluation that would be done for a development at this scale. So we didn't see that number. Um, So this is kind of the summary of this, but without cost estimates, it's difficult to assess if the future benefits of the development will be enough to cover the pre-development and the infrastructure costs. So we're kind of going blind here. So we're going to start to make some assumptions about what we think you need to do as a pre-development activity, where you can get funding for that, and how you might do that over time, and who would be doing it. So, the developers of a brownfield site are unlikely to take on unknown environmental risks. They oftentimes, the site has to be so economically valuable that there's enough, difference in there where the environmental, environmental costs can be absorbed by the development. But, typically they're not going to take on unknown risks, and there's still a lot of unknown risks on this site. The soils, the, order of magnitude costs on the environmental issue, on the asbestos and hazardous building materials abatement. So you want to quantify those numbers as much as possible. One of the things we thought was interesting too is the local utility company does offer incentives for development, but not for this type of development. So they would offer incentives for in build infrastructure for industrial development, but not for multifamily housing and housing. So that could be a large cost center. But does that open up opportunities for other alternative energy sources? Are you interested in solar? Are you interested in renewable energy of some kind? Is there an opportunity there to look at this future development in a different way? um, you know some of the challenges interesting in the ICF study is that, they have about 200 acres of the site that would be set aside or preserved as open space. That's about half the site. So you're not just talking about a development plan, you're talking about an open space plan. And how would that really work? And are there opportunities to plan for the open space while simultaneously really understanding then what the true development parcels are on the interior of the site? There's some really interesting programs out there that provide funding to plan and implement resilient, open space plans and flood control plans that then, preserve the opportunity for future development. Um, this gets a little tricky as if you're looking at, federal funds for, infrastructure and, other capital investments. You have to start to then dig down, okay, say, well, what else, do I need to be looking at in terms of technical requirements? So because you have such a mature, growth of trees, you may have to be looking at, tree preservation or forestry plan if your, development might, impact trees as a habitat. Additionally, you have these historic sites on the property. You have burial grounds. So again, if you're going to be looking at federal funding or state funding as a potential funding source for infrastructure, you have to take into account then impacts on historic and archaeological sites. So that's a cost. So who's paying for that? And again, who would be undertaking that? Um, you know, the state has indicated, they want to make sure that as they're selling off individual parcels, how does the site get developed as a whole? So, the low-hanging fruit strategy has been working well for you guys, but as you go into the interior of the property, who's making sure that, the properties are developed, in a way that really meets the overall goals, the master plan goals, to have the open space, to have the connectivity to the downtown. Who pays for that? And there are programs that you can tap into to do that, but again, it triggers all these other kind of costs. So that's kind of the high level takeaways of that. So Dale, I think the next slide is then you, and then talking about what do we do next? How do we pull all this together? And before we turn it over to Dale too, are there any, I didn't see any hands, but if I missed anything, are there any questions about any of that? Because it's a lot of information, but.
Yeah, this is Rebecca.
Mhm.
I kind of had a question. All right, so when we started down this road and when we
Mhm.
originally requested the assistance,
Mhm.
our focus really was on the infrastructure, because that
Mhm.
was the state's concern was, the water, the sewer, the gas lines, electricity, and
Mhm.
roads, and how are we going, what's the plan for that? And then what's the, how are we going to pay for that? So the environmental, can you just ignore the environmental from here on out? We have that covered. Like, we don't need to really focus on that. It's really on the infrastructure. But what I'm hearing you say, I thought that's what ICF was going to focus on.
Mhm.
What I'm hearing you say is they have not provided that information to you about, and nobody's actually done any kind of evaluation of the infrastructure that's out there. Is that correct?
That's correct.
I was going to actually talk a little bit about that in the next slide.
Okay.
So the documents that we saw from ICF is kind of a more detailed expansion of your master plan that you did for the site in 1998, or the city did in 1998. It's a goal for how the site might be redesigned and redeveloped, but it doesn't get under the hood, to say, okay, these are the physical assets uh, that need to be, taken out, replaced, and these are the costs to do it. I did not see in their documents those
Well,
actual physical numbers.
and to be fair,
Mhm.
engineering can really only be done in a very limited way under the EPA technical assistance. So, for example, we have one engineer and he will look at stuff and do costing and this and that. But I think the level of detail that Juliet may be talking about may require hiring a specific engineer or different engineers to get what you really need in terms of costs and replacements. Is that correct, Juliet?
Yes. So what we are doing is with the absence of the actual numbers, we are trying to identify what we see are likely funding needs. And we're going to try to fill those gaps. So it's, if you are looking for, money for a roadway, it does trigger other environmental reviews. So, in our development, we're trying to look at it um, from a developer's perspective. We're trying to figure out all the costs that might come up, and and guide you to say, okay, these are likely costs for this whole project in its entirety. But here's how you can start to tackle some of those cost centers. And that's the way to do it. The other way to do it is, yeah, just have an engineer come in and just give you order of magnitude estimates for, 10 miles of roadway, a sewer system that funds, 400 housing units, and other things. So that's not what the ICF study did.
I can,
Okay.
I think that if let's talk about the next slide because it kind of ties everything together, I think, a little bit. So, of course, we're not going to give you a civil engineering study, but we're going to take a look at some unit pricings to come up with a magnitude of cost, like Juliet said. So I understand that the environmental stuff is taken care of, but you still have to identify the costs. So if you have 118 buildings and that equals 100,000 square feet, you could make some assumptions on the per square foot cost. Until you actually put it out to bid and all that, of course, you're only making an assumption. But I think you can come up with a magnitude of cost. With our relationship with Mr. David and the engineering company, we could take a look at the amount of roadway, linear feet of roadway. Again, it's going to be 40,000 feet in the air at a certain dollar amount per unit pricing on a square foot basis. But we can come up with not something you can hang your hat on, but at least do you need 10 million, 20 million, 30 million, 40 million? We're going to have, within a range of 20% probably a number. But we have to have some number to use. Otherwise, we're just going to ask somebody's opinion. But I think part of our doing the stakeholder interviews and Tim's relationship with the engineer in particular, we can get some, we can get some general numbers for it without committing to it. But related to the funding, however, this is really critical. As we present the funding strategy, it's going to include finding funding for that civil engineering study that you really need. So, for example, if you're looking at FEMA, and Juliet and I have talked extensively about using FEMA on different projects, you may not have an active flooding situation, but you have a flooding potential, and resilience is a key priority in federal funding right now. Forget sustainability, it's all about resilience. That's the word. So basically, you go into to mitigate a potential problem that could happen in flooding, even though you historically haven't had it, but you never know. You could actually design a roadway system with that grant for FEMA and looking at resilience. You might not have looked at FEMA as an option, but I think it's a very viable option, especially to cover the large cost of engineering, because it is going to be a big number because the site is a big site. So I think basically our job is to put together a creative way to look at how you're going to fund the planning and design as well as the construction. Because without the planning and design, you're just going to be hoping and praying that you get a big giant grant. But there is a whole schedule of deadlines and so forth. I'm thinking of FEMA in particular, but this applies to all the new programs under the Department of Energy, federal DOT, of course, all the climate change stuff, the stuff that's listed on this slide, and EPA. But what we also want to do in our funding strategy is put this in a realistic time frame so you can cash flow how funding is going to flow and how you sequence the work that's going to be done. You just can't do 300 linear feet of roadway and then come back 5 years later and do another 300 linear feet. You have to have a master plan for the engineering, but then you can then cash flow out over a period of time, let's say 5 years. I'm just picking a number, but that's probably reasonable. And that's what our strategy is going to do, is to help you see it over a schedule of time, so that you can think about how you're going to sell off the property, plan for open space, because, as Juliet pointed out, there's a couple 100 acres basically of open space, but there's lots of grants for open space. But you can't do that without good planning. So we can only do so much with what we're working with, but we're going to do some estimating based on some historical data, probably going to have some prevailing wage stuff here because you got federal funds all over the place. And now's the time for federal funds. There's lots of money coming out from all different, cabinet positions. And so we're going to do that in the funding strategy. And we will identify some costs, but you definitely want to invest in good engineering studies. You have a good engineer, so that's great. And of course, there's procurement and all that stuff that you're going to have to follow. But But I do think that's really, this slide really talks about what we're going to talk about in webinar 2. I just bring up the Department of Energy, although people tend to think of energy, they think of solar panels. And, you know, it's probably not a good fit here because of the topography and the trees, but there are definitely other opportunities in energy to create revenue and to build infrastructure, to use that as a way of building the infrastructure, which is where we're trying to get everybody to go and think about how you do that. And so, you know, I don't know if it's geothermal, because Rebecca and I talked about that last week. With your water table, I'm not sure that, oops, I went the wrong way there. I'm not sure that works there, but who knows? But we have actually somebody on our team that we're talking to who's really an expert in the energy stuff. So he's going to weigh in on our final webinar. His name is Ryan. You'll be probably hearing from him on that webinar, as a matter of fact. So, you know, we'll also look at the different agreements that might be more applicable to some of these funding sources, some of which you already do. We might show some samples that might be helpful to you. You are doing RFP, so obviously you have your own documents, but, you know, like anything else, if you look at other ideas, I've talked a lot in my working career with Vita Nova about license agreements, for example, where you don't actually sell the property to somebody, you give them control of the property, talking about a contractor. So it's not always just a fee transaction. Sometimes it's just a control type transaction. That's what a license agreement is all about. And you've done your own version of a TIF by I think it was, you said Lowe's, where you got tax revenue
Yes.
to pay off the investment, and it worked beautifully for you. So, you know, are there other modifications of that are going to work? So these are the things we're going to explore in webinar 3. So any questions on this slide? I'm going to move on because we're coming to the end of our hour, and I want to leave a little time for conversation. So just to wrap this up, because the next slide is going to say, are there any questions? This is what we're going to do. We're going to get a date somewhere probably in mid-February. Of course, we'll be back to everybody to find the appropriate time. We're going to outline all these opportunities and put it in a schedule, but we have to do some work on getting some guesstimates of numbers. And we are going to focus, Rebecca, on the infrastructure, but the infrastructure could also mean, you know, the infrastructure as it relates to open space, as well as tax revenue, tax producing properties. And then the utility stuff, we've had some conversations with CLECO. I think we need to have more, and they're obviously an important participant in all of this. So again, we're going to bring all of this together, and then of course finish with a final report sometime by the end of February. So that's the real schedule that we have. This is sort of the thing that we update as we go along. Again, we'll have a date in February coming up for both the webinar and the final report. So let me minimize that for a minute and get back to the screen. Okay. All right, I can see everybody now again. Comments, questions, concerns?
And Rebecca, did we address your concern? It sounded like you have a concern that we're focusing too much on the environmental costs, but it seems like it's a key component of any redevelopment strategy that you need to include as a cost, in addition to the funding that you have.
And also, just not to interrupt, but a quick comment. If you go to a funding source for, let's say, a $20 million infrastructure grant, or two different infrastructure grants, they're going to want to know all the sources and uses for the entire project, including things that are already covered, like the environmental.
Yeah, if we are, you know, just being the economy of like where you need to focus your time, we've got 2 million for assessment. We've got over $1 million in cleanup funds. We're probably going to get another 500,000 next year for cleanup. So we have plenty for the environmental remediation, and we're moving forward with that. I think talking with the city and with the state, like the big impediment to really transferring this property over to the city is the infrastructure on the interior of the property. And so that's what we've tried to keep emphasizing is we need to figure out how to pay for that and what needs to be done and how to pay for that. So the more that we can focus on that, the better. And I'm sorry for laughing when you brought up FEMA. I think you have probably had better experiences with FEMA than we have in Louisiana. But if there are new fund programs that you think actually work effectively, and can actually come to fruition, before the end of the century, that would be great, to bring those around too. But I think that's really our focus. And I hear what you're saying. I mean, honestly, we have funding for planning activities as well. So when you say hire an engineer to do the infrastructure, if we need to do that now, I'd rather get started on doing that now through our funding and move forward. I think that's kind of a question that I had for Amy and Emily. I'm not sure if anyone from ICF or that group is on this call. Do we have an estimated timeline for when they are going to wrap up their section? Or is the February call going to incorporate both of those? How does that work?
Hi, Rebecca. I can find out and get back to you. I don't recall exactly when all the contractors are trying to get done by the middle of March when our contracts are over. But I'm sure given the coordination, I mean, Vita Nova team, you guys have been in close contact with them about this. Have they told you?
They have a report that we've all reviewed that's, I think, ready. It doesn't sound like it's gone out yet. So I think they're waiting for just any final comments from EPA Region 6 and to make sure that can go out then to the stakeholder group. So it's a written report, and I don't know if they anticipate doing a webinar, but it is a written report with a lot of graphics and a lot of numbers, just not the cost estimates. But we didn't anticipate having ICF participate in the February webinar. The February webinar would be Vita Nova's analysis of the opportunities, the funding opportunities, and the financing strategies. But I think they're ready to wrap up. I think there was an email
Thank you
this morning from Eliza. So check your email.
I will. There are so many reports coming in all right now. So we'll get back to you, Rebecca. So you have a clear time frame.
Okay.
For that.
So Emily, have you seen that report, Emily?
Yeah, so I believe Amy and I reviewed a lot of the commentary, and there was some edits that were made, and we approved or denied them, and we approved.
Oh, that's right. We did it last week. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
A lot of reports, Amy.
So it's close. It's close. Yeah, it's close. So
I actually have a question. I have a question for Rebecca, but this relates to the point of environmental versus non-environmental. So you have assessment money and you have cleanup money and you have more money coming in the future. So this is a typical thing where it's not black and white. Is it environmental or not environmental? So you have 118 buildings. I think they're all going to be demolished, or if not all, most of them, 116 of them, or like many of them will be. And this is sort of something Doug might want to know. Ordinarily, you cannot demo with EPA funding unless you have the phase 2 information or the building evaluation information that shows that there's a lot of asbestos, lead, or whatever the hazardous materials are in the building. I don't think that exists yet, right? That we don't really know how much EPA money could really be used for demolition versus we have to find another source for demo versus remediation. You understand what I'm saying? It's not always black or white.
Oh yeah, there's a lot of discussion on that point. And from what our experience has been, that EPA money cannot be used for demolition. It can only be used to abate the asbestos inside, or in the lead-based paint inside, with the exception of like if you have to tear down a wall, if you have to tear something down to get to the asbestos.
Right.
So if you have to tear down the wall in order to get to the asbestos, then that would be covered. If you have to clear out debris from inside a building in order to get to the asbestos tile floor underneath, that can be covered. But beyond that, unless it's directly related to the abatement activities, general demolition is not an eligible expense. I will say I'm not the one pushing it, but I know that there are a lot of land bank folks who have brought that up to EPA. So I don't anticipate that changing anytime soon. But if the Infrastructure Act money isn't spent in a timely manner, maybe EPA might become a little more flexible. I don't know. That's more Amy. Who
Well,
knows?
it makes the point that if it's not covered, and it depends on what these reports say, right? Because you have to look at each building. If there was a transformer on the building, and you have to get to the transformer or the technical equipment related to it, then we have to identify a source that's going to pay for the demo. If it's not going to be
Yes.
brownfield, that's what I'm talking about. It's not always so clear. And that's what we have to ask a lot more questions leading up to the final webinar.
I have to go, but just Rebecca, you're spot on. Yeah, it's a really high bar to get brownfields money to pay for demo.
Yeah.
So anyway, we'll get back to you with the ETA for the report and any other questions too. Thanks, you guys.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Take care.
Thanks, Amy.
Bye.
Doug, are you still here?
I think Doug had to jump off as well.
Okay, I couldn't see. All
No,
right.
Doug told you the mayor is out sick today.
Oh, that's too bad.
Hey, Rebecca and Dale, this is Cheston Hill with the State Land Office.
Oh, thank
I
you.
jumped in kind of late. I appreciate y'all coming together for this, and this is really some great information. Rebecca sent me the PowerPoint beforehand, and I just wanted to kind of underscore Rebecca's point that we are kind of concerned about the infrastructure, but I think that there's a couple of points in the PowerPoint that I think kind of tie into that and are really good points to make. Like, one of them is as individual parcels are sold, the state is going to need evidence that sales do not negatively impact future redevelopment plans for the property as a whole. And I look at another point where on-site roadways and the connection to downtown do not meet modern standards for design and safety. And so it's that sort of stuff that, as the low-hanging fruit strategy has been working well, and we're trying to work with the city to facilitate that wherever we can. But we also want to make sure that when we do sell off those parcels, those carve outs, that we are retaining enough space and enough access to be able to create the infrastructure that's needed in order to bring everything up to modern standards all the way to the interior of the property, so that everything can remain marketable and desirable property that can be marketed and sold, so that these early sell-offs, those low-hanging fruit activities don't impact the ability to do that down the road. And that's kind of a main focus, which really ties into the concern about the infrastructure.
It's an excellent point that you're making, because what you don't want to do is box yourself in. It's basically what you're saying.
Exactly.
Well, I just, I understand the history with FEMA, and it is a little bit of a new world with FEMA these days because of the money that was approved under the recent laws, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the other the infrastructure bill. So there is a program under FEMA called the Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities, and that's one of the programs we were looking at potentially for this site, because it does provide a funding source for a number of the needs that we see: the flood control, the roadway, the open space, the trail connectivity, and even obviously the the long-term resiliency. I mean, they're asking, for like a 50-year lookout on, impacts of climate change, and are these going to be resilient facilities going for the next 50 years? So there's a lot of money in that program for planning, engineering, design, cost benefit analysis, and then ultimately construction. So, if you're not interested in entertaining any kind of, ideas about FEMA, I guess we probably should know that
Oh,
because,
no, I think it's good to include, I mean, the people at we dealt with them with disasters, and our issue mostly was every
Right.
3 months we would get a new person.
mhm,
And then they didn't seem to have a really good transfer of records from one person to the next.
mhm.
So everything was really delayed. So I know, especially if they have new programs and things we can take advantage of, I would still definitely include them.
Yeah, I mean, like every other agency, you have people that have a job in a disaster, and you have people that are grants people, that are just have procedures to follow and applications to review. So,
Mhm.
it's probably very regional because of the disasters that you might tend to have there. But it certainly will be part of the alphabet soup of the funding sources. All right, we're at about 3:06. Any other comments? We're recording this right now. I'm going to get this and send it out to the whole group so you can see it. Sherry, anything from you? You're muted. There you go.
No, I don't have anything at this point. I think that was a lot of great discussion. Thank you so much.
All
Great
right.
job, Dale.
Michael Taylor, anything? Oh, I guess he not only didn't have anything, he left.
Done. Did we send y'all? We just finished up the phase 1 assessment of about half the site. Is that helpful for you to have, or is that too much information at this point?
All information is helpful. That's the way I look at
Okay,
it.
I'll send you the link to that, as well as